The sky over Manhattan was the color of a bruised plum, unleashing a relentless, icy downpour that turned the afternoon commute into a chaotic blur of umbrellas and splashing tires. Outside the towering glass monolith of Vanguard Global, Clara Thorne stood shivering, her breath hitching in the cold. Her hair was a tangled, damp mess beneath a faded plastic rain poncho that had seen better days, and her hands were stained with the dark grease of a bike chain that had slipped twice on her way uptown. She clutched a mud-flecked helmet to her chest like a shield, her boots squeaking against the pristine sidewalk as she approached the revolving doors. To any passerby, she looked like just another invisible delivery courier struggling to make a deadline, a tiny speck of grit against the polished gold and marble of the city's elite. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the sudden rush of climate-controlled air hit her like a wall. It smelled of expensive sandalwood, ozone, and the quiet, stifling scent of extreme wealth. Clara took a tentative step onto the Italian marble floor, leaving a small, dark puddle of rainwater in her wake. She didn't mind the stairs. She was focused on the heavy digital clock above the reception desk. It was 1:58 p.m. She was almost late. The receptionist, a woman whose face was painted into a mask of professional indifference, didn't even look up at first. When she finally did, her eyes raked over Clara's dripping poncho and scuffed boots with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward a small, dimly lit hallway near the restrooms. "The service entrance is around the back, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension so thick it was almost tactile. "We don't take deliveries at the front desk." Clara wiped a stray drop of rain from her forehead and tried to offer a polite smile, though her teeth were nearly chattering. "I'm not here with a delivery," she explained softly, her voice steady despite the chill in her bones. "I have a 2 o'clock meeting in the boardroom. I'm here to see the senior partners." The receptionist let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed through the cavernous lobby. "You? In the boardroom? Look at yourself. You're lucky I haven't called maintenance to mop up the mess you're making on this floor. Now, move along before I have security escort you out." The sound of the elevators chiming cut through the tension. Out stepped Marcus Sterling, the firm's senior partner and a man who carried himself as if he owned the very air people breathed. He was draped in a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year, his silver hair slicked back to perfection. He was mid-sentence, laughing at a joke on his gold-plated phone, until his gaze landed on Clara. He stopped dead, his polished Oxfords halting just inches away from the puddle at her feet. He didn't just look at her, he looked through her, his lip curling into a sneer of visceral arrogance. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing vaguely at Clara as if she were a piece of rotting fruit left on a silk rug. "Vanessa, why is there a vagrant standing in our lobby? This is a world-class firm, not a soup kitchen." "Mr. Sterling, I'm Clara Thorne," she said, stepping forward. "I'm here for the scheduled presentation." Marcus didn't even blink. He let out a dry, mocking snort and turned to the receptionist. "Thorne? Is that the name on the delivery manifest? Give her the signature and get her out of my sight. She's tracking filth all over the marble. It's disgusting. It's people like this who think they can just walk into a temple of industry and demand attention." "I'm not a delivery girl, Marcus," Clara said, her tone dropping an octave, becoming dangerously calm. "You should check your calendar again." Marcus's face flushed a deep, angry purple. His eyes narrowed into slits. "Don't you dare use my first name, you little brat. You are trash that the wind blew in off the street. You belong in a gutter, or maybe a basement, scrubbing the floors of people who actually contribute to society. You have exactly 5 seconds to turn around and walk out that door, or I will personally ensure you spend the night in a precinct cell for trespassing." He reached out, his hand clamping down on Clara's arm with a bruising grip. He began to shove her toward the exit, his strength unnecessary and cruel. In the struggle, Clara's mud-stained helmet slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the marble and skidding across the floor. Marcus didn't stop. He pushed her until she was back against the cold glass of the outer doors, his face inches from hers, radiating a heat of pure, entitled rage. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply looked him directly in the eye, a chillingly cold smile touching her lips that should have made his blood run cold. "You really shouldn't have done that, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice a sharp contrast to the rain drumming against the glass behind her. "I told you I had a meeting. And believe me when I say this, by the time the sun goes down, you are going to regret ever laying a hand on me." Marcus laughed, a loud, booming sound of mockery as he signaled two burly security guards to take over. "Toss this peasant into the gutter where she belongs," he barked, turning his back on her without a second thought. "And someone get a janitor out here. This place smells like poverty now." The golden afternoon light filtered through the towering oak trees of the St. Jude's Academy playground, but for a young Marcus Sterling, the warmth was nowhere to be found. He stood shivering, not from the breeze, but from the icy stare of his father, a man whose shadow seemed to swallow everything in its path. His father held a silver track medal in his hand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. "Second place, Marcus?" his father hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl of disappointment. "In this family, second place is just the first loser. If you aren't standing on top of everyone else, you're the dirt they're stepping on." "Do you want to be the dirt, Marcus?" The boy shook his head, tears stinging his eyes as he looked down at his scuffed leather shoes. From that day on, Marcus didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to ensure there was always someone beneath his heel. He learned that the only way to feel tall was to make sure everyone else was on their knees. Miles away, in a library that smelled of old parchment and beeswax, a young Clara Thorne sat across from her father, Arthur. There were no medals on the table, only two simple sandwiches and a worn map of the city. Arthur Thorne, a man whose net worth could have bought most small countries, didn't dress in silks or jewels. He wore an old flannel shirt and looked Clara in the eye with a gaze of profound gentleness. "Clara," he began, sliding a small, tattered budget book toward her. "Anyone can lead from a penthouse. But a true leader knows what it feels like to walk the pavement. I am giving you the greatest gift I can, the chance to be ordinary. You will live on what you earn, you will hide our name, and you will see the world for what it truly is. Because if you don't know how the world treats those with nothing, you will never deserve to have everything." Clara took those words to heart, spending years in cramped apartments with leaking pipes, counting out nickels for a bus pass, and working jobs that left her back aching and her hands calloused. She learned the quiet dignity of the invisible people, the busboys, the couriers, the janitors, while Marcus Sterling was busy clawing his way up the corporate ladder with a sharpened ego. Marcus had briefly worked for Thorne Industries years ago, a time he remembered with bitterness. He had been fired by Arthur Thorne himself after being caught inflating his expense reports and bullying the junior staff. Marcus never saw the face of the daughter, never knew the Thorne legacy had a heartbeat, but he carried that humiliation like a scar. To him, the name Thorne was a wall he couldn't climb, and he hated anyone who reminded him of the struggle he had so desperately tried to outrun. The memory of her father's voice echoed in Clara's mind as the heavy glass doors of Vanguard Global slammed shut, locking her out in the freezing Manhattan rain. She stood on the sidewalk, the icy water soaking through her thin clothes, watching Marcus through the window. He was laughing, dusting off the sleeve of his charcoal suit where he had touched her, as if her presence were a stain that could be wiped away with a dry cleaner's bill. He looked so powerful behind that glass, so untouchable, surrounded by the gold-leafed luxury of a world he felt he had conquered. Clara reached into the hidden pocket of her damp delivery vest, her fingers brushing past a crumpled receipt for a $5 coffee. She pulled out a sleek, branded black phone that looked like a piece of dark glass. With a steady hand, she swiped the screen, the blue light illuminating the fierce, focused intelligence in her eyes. The line clicked open on the first ring. A voice, crisp and formal, answered immediately. "Thorne Estate, how may we assist you, Miss Clara?" "The test is over," Clara said, her voice no longer the polite, soft tone of a courier. It was the voice of a woman who owned the street she stood on and the building she had just been thrown out of. Her gaze remained fixed on Marcus, who was now leaning over the reception desk, flirting with the woman who had mocked her. "He failed," she continued, her words sharp and cold as the rain. "He's exactly what my father warned me about. Arrogant, cruel, and completely blind. Initiate Phase 2. I want a full audit of every account he's touched in the last 5 years. And I want the acquisition papers for Vanguard Global ready for my signature by midnight. She paused, watching Marcus disappear into an elevator, his head held high with a false sense of victory. She stripped off the cheap plastic poncho, letting it fall into a nearby trash can. Beneath it, she wore a simple but elegantly tailored silk dress, a garment that cost more than Marcus's monthly car payment. She stood tall, the rain slicking her hair back, revealing the face of a woman who was no longer playing a part. Marcus thought he had just tossed a nuisance into the gutter, but as Clara turned to walk toward a waiting black sedan that had pulled up to the curb, she knew the truth. Marcus Sterling hadn't just made an enemy, he had just handed the keys to his kingdom to the one person he thought was beneath his notice. Upstairs in the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Vanguard Global, Marcus Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, the scent of his expensive cologne mingling with the aroma of freshly roasted espresso. He was surrounded by a circle of sycophants, his voice booming with a sharp, jagged edge of triumph as he recounted the afternoon's events. "You should have seen her," Marcus chuckled, tapping his gold signet ring against the table. "This little drowned rat, dripping mud all over the Italian marble, actually had the nerve to say she had a meeting. I had to personally show her the door. It's about standards, gentlemen. If we let the riffraff in the front door, we might as well turn this place into a homeless shelter." The room erupted in polite, nervous laughter, but in the corner, Sarah, his assistant, kept her head down. Her fingers flew across her tablet, but she wasn't taking minutes. She was recording. She had endured 2 years of Marcus's verbal lashings and seen him break the spirits of dozens of good people. Her jaw tightened as she captured every syllable of his discriminatory rant, documenting the toxic poison he spewed under the guise of corporate excellence. The malice, however, didn't stop at the office walls. Marcus pulled his smartphone from his pocket and dialed a familiar number, his face twisting into a mask of conspiratorial glee. "Mrs. Gable? Yes, it's Marcus. Listen, I heard a rumor that the girl in 4B, that Thorne girl, is causing some trouble in your building. I had a run-in with her today, and frankly, she's a menace. If you're still looking to clear out those low-rent units for the new parking development, now's your chance. I'll back whatever legal fees you need. Let's just say she's a nuisance to the neighborhood." On the other end of the line, Mrs. Gable, a woman who measured her worth by the height of her hedges and the exclusivity of her social circle, let out a sharp, bird-like titter. "Say no more, Marcus. I've been looking for an excuse to get that eyesore out of here. This is a respectable neighborhood, not a campsite for the displaced." Clara arrived at her modest apartment building just as the sun began to dip behind the skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows over the brickwork. She was exhausted, her bones aching from the cold, but when she reached her door, she stopped. Her key wouldn't turn. The brass lock had been replaced with a gleaming, silver deadbolt. Scattered across the hallway floor were her few humble possessions, the books she loved, a small wooden jewelry box, and the faded photo of her father. A yellow notice was taped to the wood. "Eviction for conduct violations." "Is there a problem?" a voice barked. Clara turned to see Mrs. Gable standing there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her nose wrinkled as if she smelled something foul. "I'm sure someone with your lifestyle can find a place more suited to your needs," Mrs. Gable sneered, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "You have 10 minutes to clear this hallway, or I call the police for littering." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the stairwell, and Marcus Sterling appeared, swinging his car keys with an arrogant flourish. He had driven over just to witness the fallout, to savor the sight of his handiwork. He looked at Clara, standing among her scattered books, and let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Still struggling, I see?" he mocked, pulling a crisp $100 bill from his leather wallet and letting it flutter through the air. It landed in the dirt near her feet. "Take it. Consider it a tip for the entertainment. Maybe you can find a nice, warm bridge to sleep under tonight." He and Mrs. Gable shared a smug, self-satisfied look as they turned to leave, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Clara stood in the silence that followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle, trembling touch. It was Leo, the building's elderly janitor, a man who had spent 40 years cleaning up after people like Marcus. He held out a small, wrinkled paper bag. "It's just a ham sandwich and an apple, Miss Clara," he whispered, his eyes filled with a weary, profound kindness. "I saw what they did. It ain't right. None of it is. You're a good girl. Don't let them take your spirit." Clara looked at the sandwich, then at the $100 bill lying in the dust. She didn't pick up the money. She took the sandwich from Leo's hand, her fingers trembling with a sudden, fierce emotion. "Thank you, Leo," she said, her voice cracking but gaining a new, iron-like strength. "I won't forget this. I promise you, everything is about to change." She stood in the darkened hallway, surrounded by the wreckage of her temporary life, but she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a storm, and she was finally ready to break. The news hit the financial district like a lightning strike, vibrating through the glass towers and sending shockwaves into the mahogany heart of Vanguard Global. Marcus Sterling was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, swirling a glass of 20-year-old scotch, when his phone began to vibrate uncontrollably. It was a notification from the Bloomberg terminal on his desk, glowing with a crimson urgency. Vanguard Global acquired in surprise midnight merger. The buyer was listed only as the Thorne Legacy Group, an anonymous holding company with deep pockets and a reputation for ruthlessly cleaning house. Marcus felt a cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. His hands trembled, the ice cubes in his glass clinking rhythmically against the crystal. He desperately needed to know who was behind the curtain, but every contact in his Rolodex came up empty. He was a small man in a large suit, realizing for the first time that the mountain he thought he climbed had a peak he couldn't even see. In the days that followed, Clara Thorne vanished from the neighborhood like a ghost in the fog. To the residents of the apartment complex, it seemed the delivery girl had finally broken under the weight of Mrs. Gable's cruelty. Marcus watched from his SUV as a cleaning crew hauled the last of her water-damaged books to the dumpster, a cruel, satisfied smirk crossing his face. He assumed she had crawled back to whatever gutter she had emerged from, defeated and silenced. He even shared a celebratory dinner with Mrs. Gable, toast and to the cleansing of their street. He was so blinded by his own perceived victory that he didn't notice the black sedan idling at the corner, or the camera lens capturing his every smug gesture. He thought he had won the war, when in reality, he had only finished the first chapter of his own downfall. Then, the legal papers arrived. Marcus was in the middle of a high-stakes partner meeting when his secretary burst in, her face pale as parchment, handing him a thick manila envelope. It was a dual-threat lawsuit, a personal injury claim for the physical assault in the lobby and a massive civil suit for wrongful, predatory eviction. Marcus scanned the pages, his eyes darting over the legal jargon until they landed on the name of the plaintiff, Clara Thorne. He let out a loud, bark-like laugh that echoed through the room, tossing the papers onto the table. "This is a joke," he shouted to the other partners. "This little nobody thinks she can take me on? She doesn't have the money for a bus ticket, let alone a high-powered attorney. It'll be dismissed before the ink is dry." He felt invincible again, convinced that wealth was the only shield that mattered, and since he had it and she didn't, the game was already over. But inside Clara's new world, the board was being reset with surgical precision. She sat in a sleek, minimalist office overlooking the city, the soft glow of multiple monitors illuminating her face. She wasn't looking at a bank balance, she was looking at a map of Marcus's greed. Her mindset had shifted entirely. The sting of the cold rain and the shame of being tossed into the street had calcified into a diamond-hard resolve. She wasn't just a victim seeking a settlement anymore. She was a planner executing a hostile takeover. Every time Marcus mocked her in his mind, she added another zero to the damages she intended to extract. She watched a live feed of him laughing in the boardroom through Sarah's hidden camera, her expression unreadable. Instead of reacting with a public outburst or a desperate phone call, Clara leaned back and took a sip of tea, her voice a calm, low hum as she spoke to her legal team. "Let him think he's winning," she instructed, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Let him feel safe. Let him go to the gala tomorrow night thinking he's the king of the world. The longer he stays on his pedestal, the further he has to fall. She didn't want him just punished. She wanted him to watch his entire legacy crumble in the span of a single evening. The trap was set, the bait was his own insatiable ego, and Marcus Sterling was walking into it with a smile on his face. In the quiet, sterile atmosphere of a high-tech command center, the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of keys and the low hum of cooling fans. Clara Thorne sat at the center of it all, her face illuminated by the cool blue glow of 3 oversized monitors. She wasn't the girl in the soaked poncho anymore, she was a grandmaster moving pieces on a board Marcus Sterling didn't even know existed. With surgical precision, she watched as her legal team dissected Marcus's financial history, uncovering a trail of kickbacks, offshore shell companies, and systematic embezzlement that had been hidden for a decade. Every click of her mouse felt like a hammer blow against the pedestal he sat upon. She wasn't rushing, she was savoring the silence of the grind, knowing that the most effective traps are the ones built in total shadow. Across town, Marcus was living in a different reality, one fueled by expensive champagne and a delusional sense of invincibility. He stood in his penthouse, looking at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror while a tailor pinned a bespoke tuxedo to his frame. He felt like a conqueror. To him, the delivery girl problem had been solved. She was gone, likely shivering in some shelter or back in whatever gutter she crawled out of. He'd even fired Sarah and that old janitor, Leo, just to scrub the firm of any lingering scent of the unpleasantness. He laughed as he checked his platinum watch, telling the tailor to make the fit tighter around the shoulders. "I want to look like the man who owns this city tonight," he boasted, blissfully unaware that the very foundation beneath his feet had already been sold out from under him. He truly believed he had removed the trash, never realizing he was the one being hauled to the curb. But while Marcus celebrated his hollow victory, the tables were turning in the dark. Clara spent her hours in secret meetings with the board of directors of Vanguard Global, her identity still shielded behind a wall of high-priced intermediaries. One by one, the board members were shown the evidence of Marcus's corruption. They watched the lobby footage of his cruelty and listened to the recordings Sarah had bravely provided. The air in those meetings was heavy with the realization that their senior partner was a liability, a cancer that needed to be cut out. Clara spoke to them through an encrypted line, her voice cold and commanding. She didn't just want him fired, she wanted him erased. She coordinated with Sarah and Leo, moving them into high-paying roles at the Thorne Foundation, ensuring they were protected before the storm broke. Subtle hints of the impending collapse began to ripple through Marcus's world, though he was too arrogant to see them. His corporate credit cards were declined at a luxury jewelry store, which he dismissed as a banking glitch. His usual calls to the chairman went to voicemail. His lawyers, once confident, began sending cryptic emails about unforeseen complications. But Marcus just pushed it all aside, focusing on the grand gala. He saw himself as the guest of honor, the man who would be promoted to CEO by the new owners. He didn't hear the silent ticking of the clock or the sound of the cage door locking. As he took one last sip of vintage cognac and headed for his limousine, Clara was miles away, stepping into a custom-made gown of midnight silk. The trap was set, the evidence was filed, and the hunt was finally over. Now, it was time for the kill. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed into a glittering fortress of excess, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of expensive champagne. Every pillar was draped in white silk, and the light from a dozen crystal chandeliers shattered against the diamonds and gold watches of the city's elite. Marcus Sterling moved through the crowd like a shark in a tuxedo, his chest puffed out, basking in the spotlight. He stopped every few feet to accept a handshake or a hollow compliment, his laughter ringing out with a sharp, forced joviality. Tonight was the night Vanguard Global would officially meet its new owner, and Marcus was certain that his performance over the last decade would secure him the CEO's chair. He took a long sip of vintage Krug, his eyes scanning the room with a hunter's precision, looking for anyone who might be important enough to notice him. In a corner near the grand staircase, Mrs. Gable stood fanning herself with a program, her neck draped in pearls that looked like a row of clenched teeth. She was holding court with a group of socialites, her voice a shrill, piercing whine. Can you believe the nerve? She was saying, her nose wrinkled in habitual distaste. That little girl from my building, the one who looked like she'd never seen a bar of soap, actually tried to sue me for eviction. As if I'd let a vagrant like that dictate how I run my property. Marcus joined the circle, letting out a dry, condescending snort. Oh, don't worry, Mrs. Gable. I dealt with her at the office. These people, they think a little bit of rain in a sad story gives them a right to walk among us. She's probably in a tent city by now, exactly where she belongs. The conversation was interrupted by a stir at the entrance. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as the security team doubled, and a hush fell over the room. He assumed it was the billionaire chairman, or perhaps the mysterious head of the Thorne Legacy Group. He straightened his tie and moved toward the ropes, preparing his most practiced, sycophantic smile. But as the double doors swung open, the figure that stepped through wasn't an old man in a pinstriped suit. A woman stood there, draped in a gown of midnight blue silk that moved like water around her ankles. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, regal knot, and a diamond-encrusted mask obscured the upper half of her face, leaving only a pair of piercing, intelligent eyes visible. She moved with a grace that silenced the room, flanked by 6 men in dark suits who moved with military precision. Marcus felt a strange, nagging tug of recognition in his gut, but he dismissed it instantly. This woman was royalty, she was the embodiment of the very power he worshipped. He pushed his way past the other partners, ignoring the confused looks from Sarah and Leo, who were standing near the stage in formal attire they clearly hadn't paid for themselves. Marcus didn't have time to wonder why his former janitor was wearing a tuxedo, he had a crown to claim. He intercepted the masked woman near the center of the hall, bowing slightly with a flourish that was as desperate as it was polished. "Welcome, ma'am," he purred, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "I'm Marcus Sterling, senior partner of Vanguard Global. I've been overseeing the transition personally. If there's anything you need, anything at all, you simply have to ask. I'm the man who makes things happen in this building." The woman stopped. She didn't offer her hand. She didn't even acknowledge his greeting with a nod. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze raking over Marcus with a cold, clinical detachment that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Marcus felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine. He tried to maintain his grin, but it was beginning to feel like a mask of its own. "You've done a lot of things in this building, Marcus," she said. Her voice was low, melodic, and held an authority that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "But I think overseeing is a very generous word for what you've been doing." Marcus let out a nervous, fluttering laugh. "I see you've heard of my reputation for efficiency. We've had a few minor distractions lately. A delivery girl who didn't know her place, some dead weight on the staff. But I've scrubbed the firm clean. We're ready for the new era." He leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between us, I'm the only one here with the vision to take this company to the top. I've spent years making sure the unpleasant elements were kept outside the doors." The masked woman stepped into his personal space, her scent of rare jasmine and cold rain overwhelming his expensive cologne. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice turning sharp and jagged. "And tell me, Marcus, do you still think $100 bill is enough to buy a person's dignity?" Marcus froze. The blood drained from his face as the words landed like a physical blow. The room seemed to go silent, the music fading into a dull roar in his ears. He looked at her eyes, really looked at them, and for the first time, he saw the storm he had ignited in the lobby. The diamond mask didn't hide the truth, it only delayed the inevitable. The silence that descended upon the ballroom was heavy, a suffocating pressure that made the crystal chandeliers above seem to tremble. Marcus Sterling stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, his hand still awkwardly extended toward the woman in the midnight blue gown. The air, once filled with the clinking of glasses and the hum of self-important chatter, was now so quiet that the frantic beating of Marcus's heart felt like a drum in his ears. The woman reached up, her gloved fingers catching the edge of the diamond mask. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled it away. The room gasped as one. Beneath the mask was the face of the delivery girl, but the exhaustion and the rain-streaked grime were gone. In their place was a sharp, aristocratic beauty and a pair of eyes that held the weight of an empire. Marcus's knees buckled. He actually had to reach out and grip the edge of a nearby cocktail table to keep from collapsing. His face, usually a healthy, arrogant tan, turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. "You told me to use the service entrance, Marcus," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it projected to every corner of the hall, carrying the weight of a gavel striking a bench. "You told me I was trash that the wind blew in. You even gave me $100 for a motel because you thought I was beneath the dirt on your shoes. But I decided to take your advice. I decided to change my scenery. So, I bought the building. All of them." Marcus tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. His vocal cords produced only a dry, pathetic croak. "No," he finally stammered, shaking his head in a frantic, jerky motion. "This is a mistake. This is some kind of sick joke. Who are you?" Clara stepped onto the grand stage, the spotlights catching the gold-embossed crest on the podium. "My name is Clara Thorne," she announced, her voice ringing with the authority of 10 generations of power. "And as of midnight, I am the sole chairwoman of Vanguard Global." Suddenly, the massive 4K LED screens behind her, which had been displaying the company's logo, flickered and changed. The room erupted in a fresh wave of murmurs as the lobby security footage from 2 days ago began to play. There was Marcus, larger than life, his face twisted in a hideous sneer as he grabbed Clara's arm and spat insults at her. Then, the footage cut to the hallway of the apartment building, showing Marcus laughing as he watched Mrs. Gable toss Clara's books into the dirt. Finally, the screen scrolled through a terrifyingly detailed list of offshore accounts, fraudulent expense reports, and the recorded rants Sarah had captured in the boardroom. Marcus's arrogance vanished, replaced by a desperate, sniveling terror. He scrambled toward the stage, his hands out as if to beg. "Clara, please. I didn't know. If I had known who you were, I never would have." "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Clara interrupted, her voice cutting through his pathetic excuses like a blade. "You only show respect to people you think can do something for you. You treat the rest of the world like they're invisible. You didn't just fail a test of character, Marcus. You proved you're a predator who doesn't deserve the air you breathe in this building." Mrs. Gable tried to slip through the crowd toward the exit, her face hidden behind her fur wrap, but Sarah and Leo stepped into her path, their expressions grim and resolute. "You're not going anywhere, Mrs. Gable," Sarah said, her voice filled with a quiet, long-awaited triumph. Clara looked down at Marcus from the podium, her expression one of cold, clinical pity. "You're finished, Marcus. I've already handed over the evidence of your embezzlement to the district attorney. And as for your civil standing, I've purchased every debt you owe. You're not just fired, you're bankrupt. You wanted to see me in the gutter? Well, you're about to have a very long time to look at it yourself." The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, and 4 uniformed police officers marched through the crowd. The clink of handcuffs was the final sound in the room, a sharp, metallic punctuation to Marcus Sterling's career. As they led him away, his head bowed, his expensive tuxedo rumpled and pathetic, Clara stood tall under the lights. She looked at Leo, the janitor who had shared his sandwich with her, and gave him a small, meaningful nod. The reign of the bullies was over, and the era of Thorne had just begun. The fallout from the gala was as swift as it was absolute, a tidal wave of justice that washed away the toxic rot Marcus Sterling had spent years cultivating. Within 48 hours, Marcus was no longer the king of the corporate world. He was a headline in the evening news, his face captured in a grainy mugshot that stripped away every ounce of his manufactured dignity. The courts moved with an uncharacteristic speed, fueled by the mountain of digital evidence Clara and Sarah had meticulously gathered. Marcus was sentenced to 7 years for corporate fraud and embezzlement, but his true prison was the loss of his status. Stripped of his assets, his penthouse, and his designer wardrobe, he left the courtroom in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, the very hands that had once pushed a courier into the rain. Mrs. Gable fared little better. The Karen of the Upper East Side found herself at the center of a housing discrimination probe that drained her bank accounts and tarnished her social standing until she was a pariah in her own circles. In a twist of poetic justice, Clara's first act as the new owner of the property was to dissolve the eviction notices and convert the luxury parking lot project into the Arthur Thorne Memorial Trust. The building was transformed into high-quality, affordable housing for the very workers Marcus had mocked. Mrs. Gable was forced to move into a tiny, one-bedroom walk-up on the edge of the city, where she spent her days complaining to neighbors who no longer cared to listen. 5 years later, the world looked very different. Central Park was bathed in the soft, golden light of a late September afternoon. Clara Thorne walked along the paved paths, her stride easy and her expression peaceful. She wasn't followed by a motorcade or shielded by a wall of security. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, blending into the crowd of families and joggers. She stopped at a wooden bench where an elderly man sat feeding the birds. It was Leo. He wasn't a janitor anymore. He was the director of community outreach for the Thorne Foundation, a role that allowed him to use his lifetime of wisdom to help others. They sat together in a comfortable, respectful silence, watching the world go by. Clara eventually stood up and made her way toward a nearby construction site. It wasn't another glass skyscraper. It was a vocational training center designed to give everyone, regardless of their background, a fair shot at a career in architecture and design. As she walked, she noticed a man in a neon safety vest sweeping the sidewalk outside the site. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic fatigue, his shoulders hunched against the world. When he looked up, Clara recognized the hollowed-out eyes of Marcus Sterling. He was out on parole, working a court-mandated service job. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no mockery in Marcus's gaze now, only a deep, crushing recognition of the life he had wasted. Clara didn't gloat. She didn't scream. She simply gave him a small, solemn nod and continued on her way, leaving him with nothing but his broom and his regrets. Clara reached the edge of the park where a massive billboard stood, featuring the faces of diverse young professionals under the words, "Character is what you do when no one is watching." She thought of her father and the muddy bike helmet she still kept on a shelf in her office. She had learned that true power isn't about having the most money or the biggest office. It's about the legacy of kindness you leave behind and the lives you lift up when they are at their lowest. The lesson was clear to anyone who witnessed the rise and fall of Marcus Sterling. Your position in life is temporary, but the way you treat people is permanent. You should never judge a book by its cover, because the person you push into the gutter today might be the one who owns the street tomorrow. Karma doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes, it arrives in the quiet, steady rain, waiting for the moment you think you're untouchable to remind you that we are all just human.